The Chinese regime issuing a response 3 days after Trump declared an end to Hong Kong's special status, Beijing saying there will be retaliation. In the middle of escalating tensions over the Hong Kong issue, the U.S. government is reportedly selling their consulate housing there. Senator Ben Sasse wants the U.S. to grant asylum to people in Hong Kong. He revealed his plans for new legislation over the weekend. Chinese state media taking a mocking tone over the sometimes violent protests over George Floyd's death, calling it retribution for the U.S. And hundreds of students in China developed fever and cold-like symptoms after schools reopened in April. But the schools won't test them for the virus. A student tells us more. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The Chinese regime said on Monday it will retaliate over Washington's move on Hong Kong and its actions against military-linked Chinese students and companies. It comes 3 days after President Trump began the process of ending U.S. special treatment for Hong Kong. China last week voted to move forward with a national security law on the city, which Trump said would violate China's promise to protect its autonomy. Reuters reported that U.S. lawmakers will introduce a bill banning investment in firms tied to Chinese military. Jim Banks, one of the U.S. lawmakers planning to introduce the bill, said in a statement to Reuters that, quote, on one hand, Congress is asking taxpayers to help grow our military so we can compete with China. On the other hand, large U.S. investment funds are dumping U.S. dollars into China's military-industrial base. On Monday, both Bloomberg and Reuters said China has asked state-owned companies to stop buying U.S. soybeans and pork. Under the Phase 1 trade deal, China promised to buy an additional $32 billion worth of U.S. agricultural products over 2 years. A pro-Beijing alliance in Hong Kong announced it collected around 3 million signatures in support of China's new national security legislation. A list of names supposedly from the performing arts industry were included. One of the signatures is a local musician, but he actually died last year. Another singer said on social media that he never signed anything. A pro-democratic former news anchor was surprised to find her name on the list. She denied ever signing. A pianist from Hong Kong and a film star from Taiwan hadn't heard anything about the initiative, but their names are also on the list. One of the initiators of this pro-China action is Hong Kong film star Jackie Chan. He's not only famous for his kung fu films, but also his strong support of the Chinese Communist Party. Hundreds of students got a fever after a middle school in Henan province reopened in April, but the school won't test them. Chinese media also hasn't reported on it. Wang Fei, a student from that school, told us that hundreds of students developed a fever there in the past month. We've given him a pseudonym to protect his identity. Wang said there was one day 100 students who got a fever, but the school just asked them to go back home and self-quarantine for 14 days. But some students came to school anyway. Nobody was taking it seriously. Wang said that many students also had stomach pains and respiratory discomfort. He told us that even the designated hospitals in the counties are unable to test for the virus. Only the municipal-level hospitals can do it, and the accuracy rate is low. He said the official figures are all fake, and the CCP doesn't have the capacity to test everybody. In Shanxi province, 53 students in 2 schools had cold-like symptoms. According to a notice from a county-level CDC, all students tested negative for the CCP virus. The notice says the symptoms are caused by rhinovirus. A passenger who traveled on a special flight from Germany to China tested positive for the CCP virus on Sunday. The flight carried about 200 passengers, mostly German business managers, trying to resume business in China. The passenger is a German engineer. He's asymptomatic. Before boarding in Germany, all passengers tested negative for the virus. Belgium's Prince Joachim, a nephew of King Philip, has tested positive for the novel coronavirus after attending a party in Spain. Police say they've launched an investigation. Armenia's prime minister said on Monday he had tested positive for the virus and that members of his family were also infected. Armenia, which has a population of 3 million, had registered almost 9,500 confirmed cases and 139 deaths as of Monday. A group of Australian parliamentarians are pushing back against the Chinese Communist Party's wolf warrior diplomacy with their own group called the Wolverine Club. The group consists of MPs Andrew Hastie, Tim Wilson, Senators James Patterson, and Kimberly Kitching. Over the weekend, Chinese state media Global Times published an article calling on Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison to silence these politicians, calling them anti-China. The article threatened further economic consequences. Andrew Hastie told Sky News on Sunday he would not back down, saying we won't be intimidated or silenced. He also urged Australians to sign in support of Australia's sovereignty in the struggle against authoritarian regimes. He said in a post, the Global Times is a CCP propaganda outfit. Over just the past few days, they have published 3 articles attacking the Wolverines, a group of Australian MPs passionate about our sovereignty, adding thousands of Australians are pushing back against this kind of behavior. A photo showing police officers reading a newspaper went viral after netizens pointed out they're reading it upside down. Here's a paper to illustrate. Since the title is facing the camera like this and the paper isn't opened, that means the back, this side, is upside down. Yet in the photo, the officers are all smiling and seem quite happy. Once netizens pointed it out, the official Tianjin police account quickly removed the photos. Hong Kongers may soon be granted asylum in the U.S. Senator Ben Sasse says plans are underway to introduce legislation following the city's loss of autonomy from mainland China.
Senator Ben Sasse has announced a plan to introduce new legislation this week to automatically grant asylum in the U.S. to people in Hong Kong. In a May 30th press release, he wrote, "The American people hate tyranny and stand in solidarity with Hong Kong." Last Thursday, China's State Congress adopted a so-called national security law for Hong Kong that gives jurisdiction to Beijing over Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters. The day after, President Trump announced plans to revoke Hong Kong's special trading status with the U.S. and impose sanctions on the city and on Chinese officials. Sasse wrote, "The Chinese Communist Party's willingness to break its treaty obligations on Hong Kong shows the world that Beijing cannot be trusted to honor any agreements." He added, victims of communism will always find refuge in the United States.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said in remarks on Friday that the U.S. is considering welcoming people from Hong Kong, but stopped short of adding any details about how it would play out. As tensions over the future of Hong Kong increase, the U.S. government sells off a property located in an upscale neighborhood there. And Britain's government is reportedly rethinking its approach to China. NTD's Juliet Song has more.
Hong Kong media report the U.S. is selling its consulate staff quarters in the city. This as tensions escalate over the future of the city. President Trump announced last Friday he will revoke Hong Kong's special trade status after China passed a draconian law on Hong Kong that will likely quell the city's freedom. The property put on the market is in one of Hong Kong's most luxurious neighborhoods, with a stunning view of the Deepwater Bay. State Department officials said in an email the decision is part of the government's global reinvestment program, and they're investing in enhancing other U.S. government-owned assets in Hong Kong. Despite the timing coinciding with the political clash, real estate agents say the decision is likely just a business decision. One agent says it's common for owners in this area to sell their properties after seeing the value go up. The U.S. government bought the land in 1948. Now, a real estate agency estimates the property value is between $400 million and $600 million. Hong Kong's property prices have quadrupled over the past 2 decades. Since China passed the draconian law, some Hong Kongers are looking for a way out. Migration firms are seeing a spike in immigration inquiries. One consultancy says they get an inquiry every 2 to 3 minutes, and client requests are 20 times the usual volume. Not only Hong Kongers, but rich Chinese who park their money in the city are also seeking an alternative. Hong Kong has an estimated private wealth of over $1 trillion. and more than half the money comes from mainland individuals. Now, concerns are growing that once the national security law is implemented, mainland authorities could track and seize their wealth. Bankers and headhunters say some Chinese clients are looking for other hubs as their offshore wealth base. Singapore, Switzerland, and London are high on the list. Britain's foreign minister said Sunday the UK will not turn a blind eye to people in Hong Kong. He said if China follows through with its national security legislation, the UK would lift the 6 months registration on BNO passport holders. BNO passports are travel documents issued to Hong Kongers born before the 1997 handover. It allows them to visit the UK for 6 months, visa-free. The foreign minister said passport holders would be allowed to work and live in the UK for an extendable 12-month period, and that it will provide a path to citizenship. Hong Kongers are rushing to apply for or renew their BNO passports. Aside from the humanitarian assistance, British media reports the government is rethinking its approach to China. The Spectator magazine quotes government sources, saying an important part of the new policy is to be prepared to take economic pain to reduce dependence on China. Sky News also quotes a government source as saying, "The thinking is that we are going to have a much more difficult relationship with China, and we should lessen our dependence." 7 former UK foreign secretaries are urging the British government to take the lead in coordinating an international response to the Hong Kong crisis. They said as a former colonial power, many international partners take their cue from the British government. Reporting by Juliet Song, NTD News.
About 100 protesters gathered in a Hong Kong mall during lunch hour today to protest the so-called national security law endorsed by the Chinese regime last week.
The flash protests formed at the landmark shopping mall at 1 p.m. local time. Protesters waved banners and shouted pro-democracy slogans like "Free Hong Kong, Revolution Now," while holding out 5 fingers signifying their 5 demands, which include voting rights, an independent inquiry into police behavior, and amnesty for protesters who have been arrested over the past year. Passage of the communist regime-endorsed national security law for the city is the latest sign the one country, two systems principle is perishing. Critics say it will undermine civil liberties and might be used to suppress political activity. In mainland China, public dissent is treated as subversive and is punishable by long prison terms.
One French senator says he's concerned that French government officials could be compromised by their ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Our France correspondent David Vives has the story.
With an estimated 80 French companies located in Wuhan, the Chinese city is a gateway for French businesses in the country. Could it be that this business relationship gives a bias to French politics when it comes to China? That's a question raised by Senator André Gattolin. According to him, there's been an increase in trips to China by members of parliament and businessmen over the last 20 years.
I believe in diplomacy between governments, but it remains to be seen if people are really honest about their business. Many French government officials want to make profits and benefit from trade with China.
According to sources quoted in different media, some well-known politicians have the favor of the Chinese regime. That makes intelligence services concerned about the outcome of those relationships. An example of a concerning development would be if French officials become advocates for the Chinese Communist Party in France.
The senator spent 20 years researching these types of French connections. He said in 2005, 250 French officials were invited by Chinese authorities.
I've met with senators that were in that trip. They said they met with Chinese counterparts, but who are really these people? When you look at a French map, you can see that those 250 officials are key officials at different levels in French administration.
Jean-Pierre Raffarin, former French prime minister, openly supports the Chinese regime.
Raffarin said that the virus comes from outside of China and he praises the greatness of China's response to the virus. To me, the point is that he's at the head of 2 foundations. We don't know how they are funded, but we know that they organize back and forth trips to China with French officials.
Another example of such closeness with China might be Olivier Véran, current French health minister. His counselor Antoine Tener signed a contract with the Chinese health minister for his company Illumins. Minister Véran said on February 18th that China successfully contained the virus, and that he's not sure if a country with an open social media environment could have performed so well at that.
Senator Gatolin supports human rights in Hong Kong and Taiwan and hopes more of French officials will join him. David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
The Chinese regime state media is taking a mocking tone over the sometimes violent protests over George Floyd's death, calling it retribution for the U.S. A U.S. official says foreign adversaries, including China, are taking advantage of the divide to actively promote more violence.
弗洛伊德之死所引爆的大骚乱，就是美国政客自酿的一杯苦酒。这难道不是那些政客的报应吗？
Multiple state-run media in China, including CCTV and Global Times, are calling the unrest in the U.S. retribution for American support of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. Protests broke out across major U.S. cities following the police custody death of George Floyd. While thousands marched peacefully against racial discrimination, looting, violence, and arson also happened, where local authorities say outside groups are inciting trouble since offenders are not local residents. The news is extensively covered by Chinese state-run media in both English and Chinese. Global Times called Minneapolis, where major violence happened, a beautiful sight. The term mocked a statement last year by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi when she voiced support to Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement, calling it a beautiful sight to behold at the time. The Chinese version of the commentary wrote that U.S. politicians now can enjoy the sight from their own windows. China's state-run TV station, CCTV, said in a commentary that isn't this a retribution to those U.S. politicians? Commentary has spread widely across China's social media. Multiple accounts linked to the Communist Party posted the video, including the official account of the Communist Youth League of China. Chinese authorities have also taken to platforms outside of China. The regime's foreign ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying tweeted, "I can't breathe," as a comment on a tweet by State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus when she criticized China for cracking down on the people of Hong Kong. A Chinese commentator responded to Hua's tweet saying, "I wonder Ms. Hua would also voice support for your own people's right to breathe freely when they were viciously beaten by police and when their houses were demolished." Another netizen commented under a state media report, "As if you are not discriminating against Black people, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang." Chinese authorities drew international criticism for targeting Africans in China for forced quarantines and evictions during the virus outbreak. The regime also keeps over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, claiming they pose terrorism threats. Marco Rubio, a Florida senator from the Senate's Intelligence Committee, tweeted on Saturday night that he was seeing very heavy social media activity on protests and counter-reactions from social media accounts linked to at least 3 foreign adversaries. He wrote, "They didn't create these divisions, but they are actively stoking and promoting violence and confrontation from multiple angles." White House National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien told ABC News on Sunday that foreign powers, including China, are trying to foment discord over U.S. race relations.
They're going to take advantage of this crisis to sow discord and to try and damage our democracy. We're not going to let that happen.
He said that although there are activists from other countries at work, the ones from China, quote, "it's coming straight from the government." O'Brien said the difference between the U.S. and China is that in the U.S., the police will be held accountable and prosecuted for their offense, and the case will be investigated, which is not the case in China. He said the administration stands in solidarity with the peaceful protesters who are out demanding answers and petitioning their government about what happened.
Unrest in New York City is increasing, violence erupting amid peaceful protests over the death of George Floyd. The governor is now issuing a citywide curfew from 11 p.m. after reportedly hundreds ransacked luxury stores in Lower Manhattan on Sunday night. NTD's Kevin Hogan has more.
In Lower Manhattan on Sunday night, hundreds of people reportedly engaged in widespread looting, even in luxury stores like Chanel and Dior. This was a product of violent riots that broke out at night after a day of peaceful protests in Brooklyn in honor of George Floyd. The city's mayor, Bill de Blasio, says a small group of instigators are responsible for this type of looting.
That is being fomented by a very small number of violent protesters. That is not what everyday community people are doing. I want to be very clear about that.
Thousands of protesters marched to Brooklyn's Barclays Center to make their voices heard. As the group returned to Manhattan, some protesters stood guard in front of stores with smashed windows and discouraged protesters from looting.
No, I don't want no looting.
Police Commissioner Dermot Shea says New Yorkers of various faiths and ethnicities spoke out against the criminals. He says while the NYPD are doing their part, the citizens play an important role.
I saw doormen, I saw residents coming down trying to aid. And I think that, we are a significant part of this story, the NYPD and law enforcement, but it's a groundswell that's going to really end this terrible situation that we're in the middle of now.
The mayor says small groups of protesters go in amidst the peaceful ones and use them as a shield to launch attacks on police or property. Kevin Hogan, NTD News, New York.
President Trump says he's going to designate Antifa as a terrorist entity. This comes after days of rioting and word of radicals hijacking a peaceful movement.
2 Washington monuments were damaged Sunday night by rioters. The White House press secretary laid the blame on far-left radical group Antifa, which they're now taking steps to designate as a domestic terrorist entity.
That doesn't honor the legacy of George Floyd. It doesn't further the cause. And those are violent, anarchist Antifa who are taking advantage of the pain of people, the pain of the peaceful protesters. It's inexcusable, and we have to stand as one America.
Antifa, or so-called anti-fascist groups, have publicly supported property damage during the recent protests, and journalists have extensively reported on their violent demonstrations in cities like Portland. Antifa expert and journalist Andy Ngo says they organized to destroy the country for a communist anarchist revolution. Attorney General William Barr pointed to this issue last week. He said peaceful protests in the name of justice for George Floyd have been hijacked by far-left radicals with Antifa-like tactics. On the ground, scenes across the country Sunday night resembled what we've seen over the past few days, peaceful demonstrations marred by riots. A report from the Associated Press says over 4,400 people have been arrested. And Washington took a fiery beating. McEnany says President Trump said many governors aren't handling the situation well.
It is their responsibility to police their streets. They have the police power embedded in the Constitution. They have quite clearly, many of them, failed to do their job. Look at the scenes we have seen.
In a call with the governors, Trump said he would send all the National Guard they want if they want it. Miguel Moreno, NTD News.
Some churches, once complying with the lockdown, are saying enough is enough. Pastors in California and New Jersey reopened yesterday without government approval. One of them says it's a slippery slope when government starts to control worship.
It's a slippery slope when we allow the government to dictate how we worship God.
That's the message from one New Jersey pastor who reopened his church on Sunday, even though the state's governor has his sights set on June 12th for church reopenings. And Bishop Arthur Hodges in California also reopened several churches on Sunday. He filed a lawsuit against the state, which later went to the Supreme Court. In a 4-5 vote on Friday, the court ruled that the state of California didn't violate rights by keeping churches closed. But some would say otherwise.
The more you're willing to give away incrementally, the more eventually it disappears, and you don't even realize that it's gone. And it starts a little bit by little bit.
He explained it wasn't a problem for him to close at the beginning, but as more places began to reopen and churches weren't being included, it raised red flags. He's now calling it an important time to stand up for the freedoms that America was built on, before it's too late. Bedso recalled his time spent in third world and communist countries where freedom of religion is often suppressed. And he says it's times like these when people lean on faith more than ever.
Fear is the opposite of faith. And what you feed is what grows. So with all the things that are happening, I believe we live in a fallen world. And so I believe these tragedies, like anything else, bring people closer. They have all of a sudden a sense of an awareness.
Even though New Jersey and California governors haven't given churches the okay to open yet, many reopened successfully over the weekend without any forced closures. Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
The U.S. microchip industry is seeking billions in federal funding. They want to bring manufacturing stateside and maintain tech leadership against rising competitors like China.
The Semiconductor Industry Association, or SIA, wants $37 billion in government funds to build a new manufacturing facility, support states that are trying to attract semiconductor investment, and fund research. The SIA wants to make sure it can compete with China in the marketplace. China is expected to double its share of the global chip production market within the next 10 years. The group says the U.S. risks losing its lead on countries that have been more generous with incentives. China also heavily subsidizes its domestic chip industry. SIA's proposals align with U.S. national security concerns. Even before the pandemic, the Pentagon wanted to reduce its dependence on Asia for advanced technology. Microchips are used in missiles, fighter jets, radars, and computers. The Trump administration convinced the world's largest chip maker, Taiwan Semiconductor, to build a $12 billion plant in Arizona. SIA says American companies should be helped as well. Under its plan, funding would go towards building facilities in the U.S. for both domestic and foreign companies.
The head of an Italian hospital that has borne the brunt of virus infections in that country says new infections appear to be dramatically different from the initial ones. Swab tests show patients have noticeably less of the virus in their bodies.
One of the hospitals in Italy that has borne witness to the worst of the pandemic says it's noticed a marked change in their new patients. The virus inside them seems to be losing its potency. Alberto Zangrillo is the head of the San Raffaele Hospital in Milan. Talking to Italy's Rai television, he said, quote, "In reality, the virus clinically no longer exists in Italy." According to Zangrillo, swab tests on patients performed over the last 10 days showed a much lower viral load compared to ones carried out a month ago. In other words, the new patients have noticeably less of the virus in their bodies. He also said that some experts were too alarmist about the prospect of a second wave of infections, and politicians needed to take into account the new reality. But the statement is being treated with caution by the Italian government and other health officials. A spokesperson for the Italian health ministry asked doctors not to confuse Italians until there was scientific evidence that the virus has disappeared. They instead urged Italians to continue to follow social distancing rules and maintain maximum caution. Italy has the third highest death toll in the world, with over 33,000 people dying from COVID-19 since late February. It also has the sixth highest global tally of cases. But new infections and fatalities have steadily fallen in May, and the country is unwinding some of the most rigid lockdown restrictions in Europe. A second doctor from northern Italy also told the national ANSA news agency that he too was seeing the coronavirus weaken. But the government has urged caution, saying it was far too soon to claim victory.
Here at China in Focus, we dedicate ourselves to bringing you truthful, unbiased reporting. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the latest updates, and see you tomorrow.